Morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome, everyone, both physical and virtual presences in this pavilion. And thank you for being with us this morning. The UKGBC has gathered together several of its members in Manchester and London to watch a live-streamed version of this event for those who can't be here and can't have access to COP26 Blue Zone. So warm welcome to everyone. My name is Sunand Prasad. I'm the chair of the UK Green Building Council, co-founder of Penoy & Prasad, which is a studio of Perkins & Will, and I have been honored by being the president of the RIBA longer ago than I can remember. I'm delighted to be chairing this event today in COP26, the official launch of the whole life net zero carbon roadmap for the UK built environment, and where else to do it but in the UK pavilion. So thank you very much for those who made that possible. And where else or when else to do it but on the Cities Built Environment and Regions Day, which recognizes the enormous number of emissions in tons that the built environment and road surface and other infrastructure plays as total of emissions. It's a very large amount, which is in some ways bad news, but the great thing is that it means we can do a lot in this industry to make a decisive difference in the journey to net zero. Here in the UK, the government has legislated for us to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And there is the sixth carbon budget as well, which has the ambition of reducing it by 78% on the baseline of 1990 by 2035. And that's just 14 years ago. The Committee on Climate Change itself suggests that achieving a net zero UK by 2050 should result in no more than about 100 megatons of CO2 of residual emissions by 2050. These will be offset via land use, by engineered greenhouse gas removals, and potentially other as yet to be developed technologies. And indeed, it's called for sectoral decarbonisation pathways across different industries to ensure that we're all working towards the same goal. Each industry sector should be working out what proportion of that residual 100 megatons it will contribute by 2050. And of course, these should all stack up so they mustn't exceed 100, the total budget. Now, we've seen net zero roadmaps already from the British Retail Consortium and Water UK, and more recently, the Mission Possible Partnership published a sector transition strategy for steel and aviation, although not all of them are necessarily 1.5 degree aligned. So today marks the official launch of a net zero roadmap for the UK built environment sector, and that aligns with the UK's sixth carbon budget. And just prior to this event this morning, BEIS and CLC presented on Construct Zero in the Green Zone. Construct Zero is an action plan for the construction industry and includes a performance framework to highlight and measure the industry's progress towards carbon reduction on a quarterly basis. By taking action against Construct Zero, the construction industry should be reducing its carbon footprint. Ultimately, though, the sector's overall progress would need to be validated via regular updates of this whole life carbon roadmap based on actual quantum of emissions over time. So we will start the event with a series of short presentations, and then we'll invite some industry leaders to the panel and provide their views and responses before opening out to plenary Q&A. And we're very grateful and honoured to have Lord Callanan here with us, and he and I will have a wee chat as well. I'm delighted to introduce Julie Hirigoyen, our Chief Executive of the UK Green Building Council, to present the UKGBC Whole Life Carbon Roadmap for the UK built environment. Julie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sunand, and good morning, everyone. This is a big day for us at UKGBC. So we're one of 10 GBCs that are working on a whole life carbon roadmap for the national built environment. And before I start taking you through that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the funders of this project. Laudes Foundation have done is with us today, as well as the IKEA Foundation, without whose support we really wouldn't have been able to do any of this. So thank you very much. And also a special mention to Arup and Dr. Yannick Giesekum at Strathclyde University, who were commissioned to do all of the data modelling that has fed into what you're going to see today. So the goal for these roadmaps is very much to define and identify a pathway of decarbonisation for the whole sector. So think of it as a sort of science-based decarbonisation pathway, capturing all of emissions from buildings and infrastructure, not including transport, but including all aspects of buildings and infrastructure. And as with all of the work that we do at UK Green Building Council, this has been a hugely collaborative project. We started the work in January of this year. We set up an overarching steering group. We set up 4 working groups to go through the detailed progress, and more than 100 organisations have been involved in an ongoing capacity to develop the roadmap. We've also carried out an open consultation over the summer on the draft proposals that came out, and lots of organisations, including the Committee for Climate Change, have been involved throughout the work. So this is really, really not just UKGBC's work, this is very much a collaborative effort. And the deliverables of this project are fourfold. So firstly, we have an up-to-date, a comprehensive carbon footprint of the whole UK built environment sector. And again, that includes consumption emissions, so those are the emissions that we import from purchased products and materials from abroad. A carbon trajectory through to 2050, which is that decarbonisation pathway that I mentioned, a suite of policy recommendations, as well as a series of stakeholder action plans for different subsectors in the industry to play their part. So the key graph in the whole report is, as you see it on the screen, and that shows both the latest carbon footprint of the sector based on both actual data as at 2018 and past data, as well as a trajectory, as you can see, to 2050 based on modelled data. And one of the key aims of the project was really to translate some of the Committee on Climate Change definitions into terminology that's more commonly used within the built environment sector. So the chart splits the emissions according to asset types, so domestic, non-domestic infrastructure in particular, as well as emission scopes, and most notably operational and embodied are differentiated. So as you can see, the single largest emission source continues to be that darker blue section at the bottom of the graph, which is the operational carbon from our existing homes. This is about 50% of our total UK built environment emissions, and that's primarily due to the fact that about 85% of UK homes are heated by gas boilers. Our housing stock, as we know, is one of the oldest in the world, fairly drafty. And only 50% of our homes have any form of external wall insulation. The lighter blue section just above that is the operational carbon in our non-domestic buildings, and that's about 20 to 23% of our total built environment emissions. And then there's a couple of much smaller categories, light grey, light pink, that relate to fugitive emissions from refrigeration, from air conditioning, and the operational carbon of infrastructure, so things like waste treatment works and water supply and so on. And then right at the top, those sort of amber and pale gold and brown colours denote the embodied carbon associated with different asset types. And these relate to, just to be clear, embodied carbon relates to the manufacture, transportation and assembly of construction products and materials within the sector, both at construction but also throughout the lifetime of the buildings. And again, just to reiterate, those figures all include imported emissions. Imported embodied carbon emissions make up about 30% of our total embodied carbon emissions, so important to include those. Now, to the left of the graph, obviously, you'll see the historic emissions from 1990 up until now, and although there's quite a clear reduction in the last 10 years in particular, about 25% drop, most of that is due to grid decarbonisation. In fact, in the report, you'll find some graphs that illustrate that the actual energy demand from both domestic and non-domestic assets have been fairly minimal in the reduce in energy demand in both of those types. So we're not yet really addressing the root cause of the problem. And then looking forwards, The dashed line indicates a business as usual projection based on the existing policy landscape, effectively. That's and that forward-looking trajectory, which, as you can see, looking at that business as usual line, by 2050 would fall quite short of very short of a net zero outcome. But what we've done is we've modelled against that a whole series of inputs and established the difference that they would make. It's really important to note that the project teams didn't include any inputs into this that weren't already either plans or strategies or targets out there somewhere, either in government or in industry, or already available. So that was really, really important. One of the more contentious inputs, perhaps, was the fact that we used the Construction Leadership Council's national retrofit strategy within there, which envisages that almost all homes in the UK will have been retrofitted by 2040, with a fabric-first approach, and obviously swapping out gas boilers for heat pumps and other types of low-carbon heating. Now, I only say that's contentious because we don't yet have that strategy enshrined in law, so it's not contentious for any other reason, but it's really, really important part of that decarbonisation trajectory. I suppose one of the unintended consequences that you can see there that results from that is a surge in embodied carbon emissions as we retrofit all of our homes with more energy efficient kit, insulation, heat pumps and so on. There'll be a bump in our embodied carbon emissions. So it's just important to recognise some of the relationships between these different scopes. If we look at embodied carbon as a whole, so the gold categories on the graph, what we see is that the reductions are less pronounced than in the operational carbon. That's because the decarbonisation of supply chains will take longer and is more challenging to achieve. And construction demand is set to continue growing. So that becomes more challenging. But the trajectory does indicate that by 2035, as a result, embodied starts to become the biggest slug of the whole footprint of the sector, which is really, really important in relative terms. So the good news is that by 2050, operational emissions are largely sort of eliminated in this scenario, and we can get to a very, very low carbon scenario. We're left with a very small degree of residual emissions here, which, coming back to Sunan's point about the 100 megatons for the whole of the UK economy, comes to about 7% of that, or 7 megatons, which actually, given that we're starting out at 25%, feels quite fair and progressive. So what does that all mean? What we thought would be the most important aspect is that business as usual line. And what we thought would be helpful is to set out a series of both policy recommendations and actions that the industry can already be taking to really drive that down. The most important aspect is, in order to achieve, to stay within that 1.5 degree, as we've heard all through the COP26 2 weeks, is really working hard in the next 8 years to halve emissions by 2030. That's the really, really crucial bit. So in terms of policy recommendations, there are really sort of 5 key areas that need to be tackled. Firstly, a nationwide retrofitting decarbonisation of our homes. We have about 2.9 million homes in the UK, and pretty much every single one of those is going to need to be retrofitted by 2050. That's almost 2 homes a minute if we started right now and going quite fast. So that is quite a lot of work. And so we're calling for that national retrofit strategy, that national strategy for home retrofitting, to be introduced really, really soon, as early as next year, to transform our housing, not just for a carbon and climate change improvements, of course, but also to eradicate fuel poverty, to create warmer homes, and as we know, this can also create lots of jobs right across the country as well, not to mention wider social benefits like health improvements and so on. Critically, we need a really, really strong focus on energy efficiency in order to achieve this, a sort of fabric-first approach. And that is really essential to bringing heating demand down in order to then ensure that the low-carbon heating solutions like heat pumps can be effective and available and widely used, as per the government's recent heat and building strategy. So what we need for the industry is confidence to rebuild within the sector, particularly to invest in skills right across the piece and resources, and for that we need that real policy certainty and that long-term policy framework. The key policy levers that we flagged within the report, incentives, removal of VAT on refurbishment works, variable stamp duty rates, EPC standards at the point of sale for owner-occupiers. That is our single biggest chunk of homes in this country still, and direct government grants, of course, for low-income households, of which we already have some. So that and that approach really needs to be coordinated with local authorities as well, where there is already a lot of work going on in terms of retrofitting existing areas. The second key area then is the energy performance within non-domestic buildings, and really a focus on energy performance in use and mandatory public disclosure of actual energy usage. That's absolutely key to making energy performance of buildings much, much more transparent in transactional terms and in leasing and other markets. In the roadmap, we build on and welcome the government's proposals to shortly introduce energy performance rating schemes for large office buildings. We're actually really hoping to see those roll out throughout the 2020s to other non-domestic property types. And then over time, once those schemes are well established, of course, setting out timelines for sort of energy use intensity targets and minimum standards and fiscal incentives to be introduced in order to accelerate that sort of sector by sector performance across different asset types. We do really want to emphasise also from a sort of new build perspective the importance of designing for performance. Really, really critical that from 2025 onwards, our new buildings are equipped to deliver net zero in reality. And as we know, there's a significant performance gap between how they're designed and how they operate in practice. So 2025 updates to building regs are a really key opportunity here and can fundamentally change the way energy performance is assessed, moving away from that theoretical comparison with a sort of notional building and a design model through to actual energy use in practice. So energy intensity in sort of kilowatt hours per square metre per year type metrics. And that will establish common metrics for energy performance across the industry that can be used at that design and construction stage and then measured post-occupancy evaluation through to performance in use. So really, really important shift through there on new builds. I've mentioned embodied already. This is probably another of the most critical areas. It makes up about 20% of our built environment emissions. And the trajectory, as I said, indicates that by 2035 it will be the largest relative chunk of those emissions. Currently, embodied carbon remains unregulated, and measurement and mitigation is voluntary in the industry. So we're absolutely calling for legislation to be introduced as soon as possible, ideally initially just measuring whole life carbon and disclosing that would be great. And then in due course, of course, setting targets for different asset types to minimum performance targets against that. There is a real groundswell of appetite and support for these proposals. And indeed, there are many, some present even in the room, big property companies, developers, designers who are already doing this and measuring whole life carbon emissions and tackling their scope 3 emissions. So one of our key sort of findings, if you like, is that embodied carbon can't just be tackled through the supply of products and materials, but really should also be tackled through the demand side drivers and that measurement piece up front. And then the last area that we call for is really around infrastructure, which of course will play a huge role in the sector's transition, in the national transition to net zero by 2050 across multiple sectors. And infrastructure investment really needs to be looked at holistically through a consolidated lens in looking at all types of carbon impact in the infrastructure sector. So we're showing that the embodied carbon impacts of infrastructure investment should be included in that trajectory and demonstrate that the investment in infrastructure that's anticipated in coming years is set to double by 2050. So this is also a really important area for us to tackle. It'd be crucial to ensure that that investment is directed at projects that really drive down a sort of net emissions reduction overall, and a specific focus on transport measurement, transport investment, given that, as I mentioned at the start, is a significant chunk of the sector's impact as well. And then lastly, just to say clearly, and those are a whole suite of policy recommendations, but of course, this transition is going to take radical collaboration, a term that I've heard here at COP many times, and even today several times, radical collaboration between what has traditionally been quite a fragmented sector, but every single subsector in this industry has a really critical role to play in driving this transition. So there's a series of stakeholder action plans that we're publishing alongside this, really to help clarify the actions required by architects, engineers, contractors, developers, valuers, and so on. And the professional institutes are already doing quite a lot in this space, and could do even more. I think that's quite exciting. So extensive collaboration, and everyone needs to play their part. I'll stop there, Sunand, and hand over back to you.
Thank you very much, Julie. The report will be out, and everybody is welcome to read it and comment. Now, I'd like to introduce Tanya Cox, Chair of the World GBC Board, who has, as she can't be here with us, pre-recorded a message for us about the Building Life project. And let's hope that this plays.
Hello, my name is Tanya Cox, Chair of the Board of the World Green Building Council. I'd like to thank the UK Green Building Council for inviting me to speak with you today at this Whole Life Carbon Roadmap launch, and for flying the flag for green building councils around the world and the entire building and construction sector at this monumental Cities, Regions and Built Environment Day at COP26. We all know the critical role our sector has to play to secure our 1.5 degree future, which is why I'm so pleased to introduce you to a pioneering project that's leading the way to a net zero built environment in Europe. Building Life is led by World GBC and delivered by 10 European Green Building Councils in Croatia, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Spain and the UK. In Europe, 97% of all building stock is performing significantly below the level we need to deliver climate neutrality. So increasing renovation rates is critical. Unfortunately, we also know that tackling operational energy alone is not enough. Globally, the emissions from construction materials and processes account for a significant portion of all greenhouse gases. And as our new buildings become more efficient, this proportion will continue to rise, which is where our Building Life campaign comes in. Across Europe, we're calling on industry and political leaders to adopt ambitious policies that address embodied and operational carbon across the entire building life cycle. This whole life carbon approach requires deep collaboration across the value chain. So we're developing national decarbonisation roadmaps in these 10 countries to clearly outline how the sector can move forward in concert to transition to net zero whole life carbon. At the European level, we're developing a roadmap that outlines how whole life carbon can be integrated into the EU policy framework. These roadmaps complement the operational and embodied carbon requirements of World GBC's net zero carbon buildings commitment, demonstrating global leadership, tackling the total impact of the built environment. We've seen major new commitments from both the UK government and the EU to increase their decarbonisation ambition. A net zero future can only be achieved by us addressing the total impact of the built environment with robust and ambitious policies. We hope COP26 will bring us a significant step closer to that vision. At the heart of Building Life is a call for national governments and the European Commission to commit to ambitious policies to tackle the total carbon and resource impact of our sector. Lending their voices to this call are 142 Building Life campaign ambassadors across Europe, including members of European parliaments, ministers, CEOs of prominent organisations, and national and local government representatives. Our collective vision is a decarbonised, resilient, equitable and circular built environment that facilitates a high quality of life for all. By working with stakeholders across the value chain, we're building consensus, outlining the appropriate market mechanisms, innovations and policies, and educating professionals to make this vision a reality. But we must also tackle the impact of our existing buildings, especially as there are many social and economic issues that can be addressed through building renovation, while also cutting carbon emissions. As part of the EU-funded Build Upon Squared project that UKGBC and other members of our network are leading, we're working with local governments across Europe to help them track and monitor these holistic impacts of building renovation. We're also proud to have been appointed to the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance, where we're using our expertise to ensure that the power of public and private investment is supporting a whole-of-life approach. Sustainable construction is of the utmost importance in the fight against climate change and to achieve Paris Agreement goals. That's why Building Life is so crucial. It represents an opportunity to realise the potential of our sector to transform the built environment, a transformation that is critical to the success of the race to zero. Thank you.
Very great pleasure to introduce the Minister for Business, Energy and Corporate Responsibility, Lord Callanan. Minister, we'd look forward to hearing what you have to say about this exciting subject. Would you like to come to the lectern or stay there? Come to the lectern. That's great. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sunil. Thank you for the very kind invitation for me to be present for the launch of your exciting Whole Life Carbon Roadmap report. It is a crucial time, of course, in COP26, and in this particular sector, we've seen how far that we've come, but we can also see just how far we still need to go. Because we know that decarbonising buildings is, to put it mildly, one of the more challenging parts of reaching net zero, because of course it contributes a third of UK emissions. But action in this sector is essential, and today's report has demonstrated the means by which we can do that. I'm heartened to see greater focus being given to this area from such a broad range of stakeholders, many of whom have supported the development of this report, and I'm delighted to see many of you in the audience today. Because when it comes to decarbonising buildings, we can't pick and choose. We have to tackle all emissions associated with our buildings, with their construction and with their use, which is why today's report takes a whole sector approach, looking, as Julie said, at both operational and in embodied carbon. And it goes beyond just focusing on the buildings themselves. I particularly welcome the report's focus on the infrastructure, on the industrial policies that we need to help to produce the low carbon materials that are necessary for a net zero built environment sector. And this is precisely why earlier in COP we launched our Glasgow Breakthroughs, which is a set of declarations aimed at bringing forward progress in many of these key sectors, including power, in steel and in hydrogen. The breakthroughs aim to ensure that together we can make low carbon choices the most affordable, the most accessible and the most attractive options all around the world. We know that we need to think big to tackle this issue, and we also need to act fast. As you'll have heard repeatedly through this summit, the earlier we act, the better the prospects for our planets and, of course, ultimately for our pockets. I'm pleased to say that the UK is taking the necessary steps as set out in our landmark heat and building strategy, which was published last month. Through this strategy, the UK has set out its plan to motivate and to support people to install energy efficiency measures in their homes and in their workplaces. As old boilers need to be replaced in the coming decades, government will support people to install low-carbon heating systems in a simple, fair and cheap way. We're providing new grants of £5,000 available from April next year to encourage homeowners to install more efficient, low-carbon heating systems, such as heat pumps. And these grants mean that people will not have to pay more for installing a heat pump than they do for installing a traditional gas boiler. This will significantly reduce the UK's dependency on volatile fossil fuels and our exposure to global price spikes, whilst at the same time helping to support up to 240,000 jobs across the UK by 2035, at the same time, of course, making people's homes warmer, making them greener, and making them cheaper to heat. Over the coming years, industry leaders expect heat pumps to cost about the same as gas boilers to buy and to run, plummeting in price in the same way that offshore wind has done. To help ensure that electric heat pumps are the most affordable options, we know that we also need to reduce the price of electricity over the next decade by shifting levies away from electricity bills. At the same time as growing the market for pumps, we're also growing the market for heat networks, also investing in research in hydrogen for heating, so that we can take the informed decisions that will be required on its role in heating in sometime in the middle of this decade. And all this activity will go a long way to reducing operational emissions from the UK's existing building stock. On embodied carbon, which is, of course, the carbon footprint used in construction, we agree that disclosure and reporting of data is vital to help us to better understand the problem. I'm glad that we've been able to commit to improving data disclosure and reporting for major public construction projects in the UK. And also, of course, that we brought along several major country partners with us, agreeing to do the same, as was mentioned, including Germany, Canada, India, under a new clean energy ministerial initiative. So working with international industry leaders and learning from other governments' experience has greatly helped us to inform our policies here in the UK. So in that spirit, we hope to further strengthen such forums of international collaboration to help make the transition in buildings faster, to make it easier, and to make it cheaper for all of us. Working with organisations such as the UKGBC and the network of green building councils around the world that we heard from, as well as the Global Alliance for Buildings and Constructions, we hope to share learning around best practice for building decarbonisation. It'll continue to be a strong focus for us as we enter our COP presidency year, as we aim to build on the momentum that we've all achieved here in Glasgow. So to protect the planet, we need to think about the places that we create, ensuring that they add to the world and not ultimately take away from it. So I very much look forward to hearing the panel's reflections on this very timely report. Thank you very much indeed, Sunil, for the kind invitation to join you today.
Well, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions. They both are really about the next steps and further ambitions, which is what, after all, COP is about. So the whole life carbon roadmap shows, and indeed the buildings and heat and building strategy shows that the biggest contribution to be made to net zero is through the retrofit of existing buildings. Yeah. You've mentioned it. There's a very interesting figure, right? I think beyond page 190 of the heat and building strategy. About
Please
200.
somebody has read it.
Yeah, yeah, nerds united here. Which says that actually existing buildings are not only the most important, but the contribution of new buildings is only 5%. We can only change by 5% what we are going for if we focus on new buildings. So what further policy measures do you think that will be needed to ensure that we address energy efficiency before we, as a priority, before we go on to tackle the issue of where that heat and energy comes from? I'm very welcome, of course, the heat pump strategies and so on are, but what about the fabric of the buildings, and what might you tell us about that?
Okay, that's an extremely good question. You're of course right. We need to tackle the retrofitting challenge in the UK, and I'd be lying to you if I said it was an easy challenge. Of course, it isn't. It involves some very difficult political choices. The Chancellor just announced at his spending review expenditure of something like £3.5 billion over the next 3 years, targeting in a number of different sectors and areas, primarily concentrated on the poorer members of society, those earning less than £30,000 a year in the UK. So targeting through the Home Upgrades Grant, through the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, through the Boiler Upgrade Scheme, which is, as you said, targeted at all members of the population, not just those in fuel poverty. There are a range of different sectors. So that's the financial support that we can put in place. Of course, the task, the ultimate bill will be enormous, in the hundreds of billions, and it's unreasonable to expect the taxpayer to pay for all of that. So we also need to look at regulatory interventions. We consulted on regulation of the private rented sector earlier this year, and we're going to be announcing the outcome of that consultation shortly. We're looking at the industrial sector. You mentioned it in your report in terms of disclosure. And, of course, the really difficult challenge is the social housing sector, which we do have a number of interventions in, working closely with housing associations, with local authorities, substantial grant supports in that area. And we also need to come on to the owner-occupied sector, which does present some political challenges, and it's an area that we're looking at the moment in terms of how far we can go.
Thank you. Any chance of a roadmap for decarbonising or retrofitting the social housing sector in a set time? Would that be an idea to show the rest of industry what can be done, and the government is actually leading by example?
Well, I mean, we are doing, whether we want to go as far as a roadmap, I'm not sure, but we certainly, the difficulty with that is that, of course, it's hard to say exactly what economies of scale we'll get over the years. We've announced something like £800 million worth of funding through the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. We did the demonstrator project, been out to view a few of those schemes. It was extremely successful. I think Minister Eddie Hughes from DLUC was also here. We went to view some of them together in Manchester recently, working extremely well. We're about, I think, in the next couple of weeks to announce the winners of the latest policy competition for another, I think it's £300 million worth of funding of local authorities and housing associations. In the future wave, we're going to open it to housing associations directly, so they don't have to go through local authorities for the funding. Of course, there are a number of challenges in the area at the moment. A lot of the schemes are subject to delay. There are a number of challenges in the supply chains. People are having trouble getting hold of materials. This is a worldwide problem. The cost of the materials is increasing greatly. So, of course, as that happens, the number of properties that we're able to retrofit from the set budget is declining. But again, we hope as the scheme is rolled out, as the supply chain gets more used to it, as people expand their labour forces, etc., that we will get the economies of scale, and that we will be able to increase the number of properties that we do from the same amount of finance.
Thank you. Let's move on to embodied carbon. You mentioned that. That's very good to hear. And good to hear the beginnings of those initiatives about disclosure. But then, of course, we may well need to move on to enshrining this in regulations, in setting maximum levels of embodied carbon for various types of buildings. Can you shed any light on the government's ambitions in that regard, even if not immediate?
We're at quite an early policy stage in this at the moment. You're right. Disclosure is the first challenge. So once we we'll agree to work together with a number of other governments to increase disclosure of embodied carbon for new buildings. We'll see how that goes, and then we'll look at whether we need to regulate in those sectors in the future. Of course, we also have, through the net zero strategy, through the industrial decarbonisation strategy, a number of policies aimed at targeting steel industry, cement industry, etc., in terms of helping them to decarbonise in the supply chain as well. So we need to approach it both from the input level and also look at what we can do in terms of regulation in the future and the output level as well.
Thank you. And would you mind if I ask about VAT? Any chance of the 15% on retrofit being taken away or reduced?
You're perfectly entitled to ask about it, but I'm afraid you must have missed the Chancellor when he was here in COP last week. And you will know that the kiss of death for any minister is to commit the Chancellor to policies on taxation that he hasn't agreed to. So,
oh, I don't want you to commit anything.
I would be happy to give you my personal view sometime after I've left government, but at the moment, I might be leaving government sooner than I thought about commit the Chancellor to tax policies. You'll have to lobby him and wait for future fiscal events when he might announce such policies.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, Lord Callanan. Big hand. I believe you might be able to stay with us, or yeah, that'd be lovely. So I'm delighted to welcome now three very experienced industry leaders who will provide their views on what you've heard and where we need to go. Firstly, please welcome Donald Brennickmeyer, who chairs the investment committee of the Laudes Foundation and the Argidius Foundation, and was previously Chief Brand, Customer and Sustainability Officer at CNA, before becoming the retailer's Chief Innovation Officer. Next up is Mark Allen, CEO of the UK's largest property company, Landsec, and since April 2020, and prior to that, he was the CEO of St Modwen PLC and the Unite Group, amongst others. And we have Dame Joda Silva, DBE, Sustainable Development Lead at Arup, who received a damehood earlier this year for her instrumental role in setting up Arup International Development for humanitarian relief work around the world. So could I just start by asking each of you to give us views, maybe just a couple of sentences or maybe even a couple of minutes on the importance of this roadmap and where you think it might lead us and what hopes you have for it going forward. In that order.
You'd like to give me to go first? Thank you very much for having me here, and maybe just starting briefly. I think that we all recognise the journey we collectively need to be on to decarbonise every single sector that we're in, and we can only do that if we propel and launch innovations in a collaborative way and really find new solutions to tackle the challenges that we have. At Laudes, we're very pleased to have been able to support and fund the activity to the creation of the roadmap that we've seen launched today. I think it really sets the scene for how do we go forward and give pragmatic examples that we can now get our heads around and our teeth into, using all different forms of capital. And at Laudes, we're a foundation that aims to both promote addressing climate change as well as also inequality in a number of different sectors, including the built environment. And we, over the course of the coming years and months, will be wanting to further our efforts to really accelerating what we see as the output of the report. Just a number of things that we do. For example, we launched with the Bezos Earth Fund, together also with IKEA Foundation, that helped also with this report, to further the grants on Science-Based Targets initiative for the built environment. Another key element of being able to provide the data, the metrics, the measurements that allow us to also capture both operational carbon as well as embodied carbon and make that available for industry, for governments, for policymakers, for developers to start a transition towards a low carbon future. 2 weeks ago, we also launched a new foundation called Built by Nature. Built by Nature is focused 100% on accelerating the timber industry as a solution to substitute steel and cement within the built environment and use the lowest form of embodied carbon as a solution both in retrofits as well as also in new build. And we all know the challenge that we have, that the built environment will grow to double the size that it is today. So very pleased to be here and supporting you in the launch today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Don. Mark?
Yeah, Thank you again for the invitation to be here today. A couple of brief words on Landsec to put our support of this initiative in context. We were the first commercial real estate business in the world to set a science-based target in 2016. In 2019, we moved to align that to 1.5 degree global warming scenario, and since that date, every building that we commit to is designed to be net zero, both in construction and in operation. And within the next week or so, we will be setting out our own roadmap, fully costed, for the investment we need to make from here in our existing assets to remain on that track for the remainder of this decade. So the most important thing I can say is that we very much endorse the findings and recommendations of the report. Three brief things I would flag. One is probably very obvious. The slower we start, the steeper the curve. So I think we're all acutely aware of the emergency, the urgent nature of moving forward and working without question collaboratively to achieve that. The second thing I would say is that measurement drives behaviour. So talking about embodied carbon targets, for example, I think is hugely important. 2 of our last 3 central London office developments have incorporated or retained either the entire or substantially all of the existing structures on site, and that's simply been because of our embodied carbon targets within development. But I'd also talk about EPCs and the risk of a sector focusing too much on theoretical energy performance and not enough on what's actually happening in use. It's a little bit like those manufacturer fuel efficiency official numbers or the range that your Tesla can drive. If you rely on those numbers, you'll never get to where you actually need to be. So looking at energy in use is absolutely critical, and we've just been trialling artificial intelligence within building management systems to look at the absolute impact that can have on energy consumption. And then the third and last point I would say is simply that we're pushing on an open door here. In the last 18 to 24 months, the investment markets, the occupier markets, for offices in particular, have moved dramatically to the extent that this is very much where capital and resources are being pointed. And in a market-based economy, that's the most powerful thing that can happen.
Thank you. Joe?
Okay. Thank you. I work for Arup. We are a global firm of 16,000 people, and we design buildings and infrastructure. Thank you for inviting us to participate on the panel. As Julie said, we did the carbon modelling, not myself, a much cleverer, different team did the granularity of modelling. As designers, we sit right in the middle of the value chain of the built environment, with investors at one end, contractors, material suppliers, and occupiers at the other end. And therefore, we really welcome this report because it sets a clear agenda and signals which we can all work towards and work together towards, rather than us all individually trying to tackle this agenda, doing our bit, but it doesn't add up to an overall jigsaw. I think we're at a really important point. We have to wake up to the fact that we're not going to halve emissions over the next 8 years unless we move from carrots to sticks. I first started looking at sustainability in the built environment in the mid-90s. That was when the rating tools like LEED and BREEAM, came on board. These are rating tools. They're carrots. They're not sticks. And I welcome this report, which is actually putting forward the next step, going from voluntary to mandatory to disclosure and then to regulation. I want to really also applaud the emphasis on embodied energy. This is critically important. As a structural engineer originally, we felt we didn't have too much to do with the sustainability of buildings. That's changed radically. And embodied energy, consumption-based emissions are becoming increasingly important. We published a report earlier this year, which we did with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where we did detailed granular analysis of 6 buildings projects to understand what actually contributes to embodied energy. And it was full of surprises. Yes, the initial construction is really important, but so is the retrofit during the life cycle of the project. The facades and the building services, the furniture, the ceilings, the carpets, the fit out, all contribute as much as the structure and the foundations if you look at a whole life cycle analysis. And that's why I've managed to persuade with others our firm to make sure that whole life costing is carried out on all our projects. And I think the second shift that is absolutely essential is that we start thinking about the built environment in the context of a circular economy. We're not going to get there just by resource efficiency. We've got to actually change business models and shift to a circular economy.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. Is this working? No, it's now working. But I can just shout. Very clear common theme. You know, the thing about there's not very much time. The earlier we start, the quicker we'll get there, Mark says. You're talking about 8 years. You know, where is this acceleration going to come from? We all, I think, all feel that we know what to do, what needs to be done. So what's stopping all of that? What would make us accelerate? There are fantastic individual examples. How does this become normal?
From our perspective, setting targets and being held to those targets and making sure that those are sufficiently ambitious.
Are those the sticks that Joe's talking about, for example?
We've set our own targets, and I think the market is moving in a direction of realising there is more value to be had, because there's nothing more concerning for an investor thinking about buying commercial real estate that they may have to invest an extraordinary amount of money in it in 10 years' time in order to achieve regulation. So I think there's an opportunity, and people are moving ahead of regulation, but without question, a combination of carrot and stick, I think, has to happen. But then businesses need to set out their investment strategies and their roadmaps, and we're planning to do that ourselves very shortly.
How does that affect the existing built environment, the big mountain that we have to climb? How do we, you know, because it's atomized, it's all over the place.
So with respect to our own little bit of that built environment, we're invested in about £11 billion of commercial property. Our roadmap and the investment we'll be making will be focused very much on air source heat pumps, looking at building management systems to reduce energy intensity, to move more onto the grid to take advantage of that decarbonisation. Now, there's many, many billions will need to be invested in that, and as you said in your comments, just looking purely at the new buildings, it just sort of scratches the surface. We need to have those clear strategies. But of course, even then, there is still an element of offsetting, or certainly for the next 20 to 30 years, and that needs to be sustainable and responsible offsetting.
Don, you actually support far more than the built environment. Actually, you are aware of what's happening in the fashion industry and other places. Are there some cross-sectoral lessons we can learn in accelerating?
So I think that one of the most important things is to bring all the players together. So about 6 years ago, we created an organization called Fashion for Good. It was all around trying to create a circular system that would allow industry players to work in a pre-competitive space to actually promote and accelerate the innovations needed to find circular solutions in the fashion space. And I think that we can learn in the built environment from that and say, well, how can we all work together collaboratively and say a project that is successful in Milan, a project that's successful in Barcelona, or even with Scandinavia, for example, the recent collaboration between Lend-Lease and Stora Enso, to say how can we actually promote new materials in a way that for new builds might be the easiest way to showcase it, but then you can start to actually think about how can you bring that into retrofits as well, because you create enough demand with a supply system that can be created to allow for actual retrofits to benefit from that. And those are things that other industries, such as the fashion industry, has already been on, and starts to break down those silos that exist between the natural players within a value chain.
Thank you. And Joe, can you give us an example of an accelerator stick?
Yes, I think some of the suggestions in the report would, if translated into policy and regulation, would cause massive acceleration. I think the real-world performance of buildings is a critical issue. We can design buildings to be incredibly energy efficient, but it's how they are used that matters. And one of the key findings that came out of this work was how much of the energy is down to the way people behave in buildings. In terms of how many plug sockets they're using, the movement in buildings in terms of elevators and staircases. So I think we have to make people part of the solution, We have to create the sticks in terms of policy, legislation, probably moving from ratings to disclosure to policy in steps. We can't do it all overnight. The final thing too that I also feel quite strongly about is that we're not going to get there one building at a time. And I think one of the fundamental issues we face at the moment is that that's the approach. It's the approach to retrofitting domestic housing. I'm desperately trying to get solar panels on my roof, and they were meant to arrive on Monday, and they didn't, and I asked why, and I was told I needed planning permission. But it's ridiculous that I am, as a homeowner, procuring solar panels as an individual. We should be having much bigger schemes for nationwide retrofitting of housing and, portfolios of commercial buildings and also our public buildings, our schools, our hospitals. And rather than taking them one at a time, to actually think about large-scale programs that do this and get the economies of scale out of that. And that will change the market too and create the demand.
Thank you very much. I think we have just time for one question from the audience. Is there somebody who'd like to do that? Sorry, I have one there. Actually, I'll take one there, and we'll just hear the questions. We'll hear the questions. We may not give the answers.
Julie talked earlier about radical collaboration. I just wonder maybe sort of some of the views on actually how you get that radical collaboration between industry and the government to drive the speed of change that's taking place.
Thank you. Lady over there.
We heard a lot about the need for housing retrofit, and we discussed a bit of social housing, but I believe the private sector is the hardest one to address. So how do we fund private sector retrofit?
Thank you. Anyone else? Last one. One chance. Okay, one more. Sorry, you're too far away. Okay, no, you're not too far away. Very quickly.
We're hearing a lot at international level from the big international firms about what they're doing in policy change, but on the ground, that's not reflected in what local and regional offices are doing in things like road projects. I'm not going to mention names, but I would like to talk to somebody on the panel afterwards, and I'm from Ireland with a particular panel with a particular project. But this is an international issue, saying one thing at global level and then not taking action on the ground.
Thank you very much. So, everyone, we've got 1 minute, 41 seconds.
Shall I take the first question?
Go for it.
Yeah, just in terms of the radical collaboration piece. So one of the, we're seeing cities around the world actually embrace the challenge, and we support, for example, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and they're also really trying to showcase projects that work. And I think that there you start to see leadership that wants to engage, that wants to understand what really the solutions are that can help transform the cities for the people in those cities that they represent. And I think that what we can do is sometimes as philanthropic capital is actually create the stage, create the forum for the conversations to take place between cities and then also between industry and solution providers and forestry individuals as well. And that then starts this groundswell of momentum for actual broader change, and eventually also government to start saying we're going to legislate and mandate for change.
Brilliant. Thank you, Don. Mark, and last minute.
Yeah, and from a collaboration point of view, one of the things that I'm very focused on is looking at probably the circular economy, but the whole supply chain. If I look at the way that our sector is set up at the moment, it's incumbent upon us as the developer at the top of the tree, as it were, to set very clear standards of what we expect through the entire supply chain. And only by doing that do you then effectively force that collaboration through the supply chain, but it goes the other way as well. In the commercial real estate sector, you let to individual tenants within buildings, you recharge everything via a service charge. We need to be able to work together on those sort of things.
Thank you. We actually, apparently, guillotine comes down exactly in 8 seconds, but Joe, private sector, I think we'll dribble on, but quick word on that.
The key to collaboration is convening. It's bringing together the different actors in the ecosystem so they can actually talk to each other. And in terms of social housing, we absolutely can't do it one building at a time. And we're working with Camden at the moment, a local authority in London, looking at how we can help them tackle the retrofitting of the social housing in the borough as a whole.
Thank you very much. Julia, do you want to just quickly say, Julie, what the next steps are?
Sorry,
The next steps on the.
Okay, I mean, I think the roadmap really is the starting point. You know, it's sort of where we are today. I think we've set out all of the action and policy that's required to make progress against that. We're committed to, and I think it's absolutely essential to continue to measure that on a timely basis, either annually or biannually, and to measure the progress of you know, the policies that get introduced, and then to use some of the findings of the roadmap to set energy use intensity targets, embodied carbon targets, and so on and so forth. So the really granular stuff comes next. But for now, I think there are some on my team who would not forgive me if we were carrying straight forth to the next stage. So I do want to do a shout out to Tom Spurrier, who was the programme and project manager, who's in the corner there, and Alexandra Yonker, and also Alex Green from the British Property Federation, all of whom have been instrumental to the work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and I think the Roadmap Roadshow starts now, quite soon. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, panel. Brilliant. Have a good rest of the day.